name is Keith. I'm here in the upper bar of the Heart Bar Belfast with that Bastard Chapman.
Alright, I'm Chubby. I'm a bass player in the Groundlings and guitar player, singer in the Electric Bell Conspiracy.
What's your sort of overall aim in your music?
To play good music to a half decent amount of people, and 30 or 40 years after my death, people find like a wee CD or a wee record and, "Oh, here, have you heard these?" to their mates or whatever.
Yeah.
That's all I'm looking.
Yeah. So as far as your influences are concerned, and what would inspire you musically and non-musically?
Musically, I am inspired by the whole history of rock and roll, from blues in the early 20th century right up until now. And most of my favourite bands, apart from maybe the obvious big ones like the Beatles or whatever, most of my favourite bands are bands that never seen fame in their time. Whether it was Sonics or the MC5 or Dead Kennedys, Misfits, The Prisoners, millions of bands I can name that were brilliant, were doing music that was better than anyone else around their time, and they were completely obscure.
Yeah.
And if it's good enough for them, it's good enough for me.
Okay, so obviously these influences would inform your writing.
Right.
And can you tell me a bit about the writing process, how you go about that? Is there a certain pattern that you follow, or is it kind of just like a trial and error sort of thing?
Sometimes if you're practicing with a band, you jam, and somebody will come up with a riff, and you jam on it and see where it goes. But when I write songs, mostly they come into my head, and I either sing them into my phone, or if I'm near a guitar, I'll play it. And it's rock and roll basically, and when it's not rock and roll, it's a bit of punk rock, and if it's not a bit of punk rock, it's a bit of blues, and they all follow the same pattern, mostly 3 chords, mostly.
Yeah. Do you think then that kind of music, do you think has any relevance in Belfast in this particular era that we're living in?
I'd said earlier to someone, I have a friend who hates the word relevant, hates it being used, thinks it should be outlawed, and I use it quite a lot, and he thinks that it shouldn't be used when it's talking about music. As far as relevance is concerned, I have 3 kids, and a couple of them don't like my type of music at all. They like what's popular, hip hop and dance and whatever. And the only relevance that I can say is the music that I do is if I can get a couple of people into rock and roll, it'll continue rock and roll's legacy or lifetime past, because rock and roll in mainstream terms is dead.
What do you mean by that?
Well, rock and roll in every decade up until the 80s, and then the corporations perfected their awfulness. Every decade had a great. In the 50s there was great stuff in the charts, but also awful stuff in the charts. But there was also great stuff happening underground. And in the 60s the same was true. In the 70s, and then the 80s there was all the good stuff started going out of the charts, mostly, as in rock and roll. And you could only find good rock and roll underground. You couldn't switch on top of the pops and hear or see great rock and roll bands anymore. It just stopped happening. And then the end of the 80s, where Nirvana, rock and roll became a thing again, or at the start of the 80s, should I say, when Nirvana became famous. But it was just a bit of the underground finally broke through again. And maybe 10 years later, when Queens of the Stone Age broke through or whatever, again, there's odd pockets of real great rock and roll makes it through. But usually it's rock and roll. It's not a musical form that's loved by millions of people like it used to be.
Are you aware of any kind of established path that bands can follow to kind of get from one platinum to the next?
No, you see, this is the thing, is when I was a kid, like Gene Vincent was my hero, and all those sort of early rock and roll guys, Buddy Holly and Eddie Cochran, before punk erupted and all, and people that I thought were world famous weren't, or were for a very short period of time. Like Gene Vincent was world famous for Bebop Balula, and he had a couple of other follow-on hits, but he then faded into obscurity, and he ended up having to just go round pubs and bars and small venues the rest of his life, trying to eke a living. You know, so there's so many others. You could say Gene Vincent was famous compared to Link Ray, who was making great music and never had a hit and never was famous until, you know, 40 years later. And even, you know, he's put on Pulp Fiction soundtrack or whatever, but even then the fame doesn't come, it doesn't get you millions of record sales or anything, you know. So the people who I thought were world famous and people who I loved were only famous for a couple of years or whatever, had a hit or two in the 50s or 60s, and then faded in obscurity or died early deaths or whatever. And bands like, you know, like the MC5, for example, you know, weren't famous in any way, or the Stooges, or I've said before, the Sonics or whatever. These were bands that went for a couple of years and made amazing music, and fame was never going to come to them, you know. A slight bit of with some bands make the breakthrough. So you have a band like, say, Black Sabbath, who become huge, become an actual huge band that, you know, actually become world famous or whatever. But even they are, to your average music listener, total obscure. You know, Black Sabbath, I wouldn't listen to that sort of stuff. Yeah. Well, they are actually a famous band, you know.
Yeah.
And a particular favourite band of mine that came out at the same time is the band, the Screaming Trees. To me, the Screaming Trees have made music that no other band has touched in the last 30 or 40 years. And they were signed with Mudhoney and Nirvana and Soundgarden and all these bands, and they never made the breakthrough. And so when I look at bands like that who make the most beautiful music, and to total disinterest and indifference, then I can't reach for more than that. I can only reach artistically. I can only say I want to do something that's like that, and if fame and fortune isn't part of the deal, you know what I mean, then I accept that wholeheartedly.
You were mentioning earlier before about the underground scene. Do you think that there was actually a kind of thriving underground scene here? There's
always been a thriving, now several.
Or even generally speaking.
It used to be in the 80s and 90s there was an underground scene that all congregated at the art college, and there were punk and hardcore bands, but also other types of bands played it, and everybody went because it was the only place you could go to see alternative music.
Yeah.
And then the Limelight, as the 90s went on, the Limelight did the same thing. And the Limelight would have been bunged with 300 people on a Thursday night to see whoever was playing.
So you actually think there is a fair amount of support for?
No, well that I'm talking about years ago.
Right.
Now there's so many different venues and so many different scenes that there's a couple of different alternative scenes and a couple of different underground scenes. So when you put a gig on, only the people that are into that specific type of music will go to it, and only that specific type of music will play for this particular scene. And so you might get 30 or 40 people at certain gigs in Voodoo or certain gigs in Menagerie, and then other gigs the same, you might get 30. Well, if these sort of scenes sort of joined, like if they were sympathetic with each other, like say the garage and the punk scene, or the metal scene and the, you know, all other alternative stuff, and had a venue or an eclectic sort of bunch of different bands played, and you got all the different fans from the different bands to come, then you could be bunging out, you know, the Menagerie on a Saturday night or Voodoo on a Saturday night or whatever, rather than it just being, you know, a load of your mates and a few of your people that have came, you know. Yeah. But that's just it's just as the duality of it is it's both good and bad.
Yeah. Are you aware of any kind of interest in your music further afield, like across the board, or even internationally?
No, basically I was just saying I was practicing my groundlings earlier, and we got played on a rock and roll radio show in New York called the Rock and Roll Dance Party. It's a show that's like a college radio station, and it probably only has about 200 people listening to it. But I listen in on the internet, and I've been listening for the past 10 years. And he played one of our songs the other night, and that's my top of the. That's me getting on Top of the Pops. You know, a radio show that I listen to has played my band, and a few of the people who listen to that show, and it might only be 200 people, they'll hear my song and Whether they like it or not, I might know about it, you know. But that's to me, that's brilliant.
Yeah. Well, finally, I just want to ask, what motivates you to pick up your guitar and sing and write songs down stage?
I think it's probably like being an alcoholic or something like that, where I can't help it. I did have a break when I had started having kids 16 years ago, and I realised I had to give up music for a couple of years at least, and I stayed away from music for about 68 years, and it was always at me, you know. Whether it was just, as I say, homing into my phone or picking up a guitar and going, right, I have to get a band together again, and I finally did it, you know. Bit midlife crisis-y and all that, no, but you know, it's something that when I go to bed at night, you know, songs are constantly in my head, you know, so it's something that you know, it's just always at me to make music. And being in a band in Belfast can be one of the most disheartening things out because we are a capital city, but we're not really. We can't get the crowds at Dublin or London or Glasgow or whatever, or Edinburgh or Manchester, all big music cities, where you probably get loads of people coming to you, to your gigs, like having healthy scenes. Here you can be playing to 20 people, and it's cost you to practice. It's cost you for taxis or petrol money. It's cost you to play gigs. Cost you to record, and you don't get anything other than the adulation that comes with applause or whatever, but just the satisfaction of getting your music out there. But it can be totally disheartening when it is only 20 or 30 people, and you're thinking, why am I doing this? You know, but you're doing it because you're a raging alcoholic, or you're doing it because you're a fucking raging musician. You know, I just can't help myself. My lud.
Thanks very much.
Cheers. Thank you. Was I quivering or anything? It seemed that it sounded as if I'm getting almost.